just generally defining what a rule maker is. This is just a really simple definition that I came across, and it's just simply a person who draws up a rule or rules, or a person who's a maker of regulations. So when we think about development finance, who do we think about when it comes to controlling development finance? Where does the finance come from? How is the finance spent? What are the conditions and the terms that come with the finance for development in Africa? Who do you think about? And oftentimes when we are reporting, we refer to these global institutions, right, which are mainly controlled by Western people, if we're to be very honest. Do you think about the IMF? Do you think about World Bank? Do you think about UN? But then also looking at it from the context of the African continent and who is driving the conversation on finance, who is actually talking about, where the investment should go. How much do you know about the AFDB and what sort of financing they have? What about the national and the multinational levels? When you talk about your country, whether it's Ghana or Morocco or Egypt, who's doing the financing on the local levels and even just the sub-national levels as well? So those were some of the things that I thought about when we talk about the African narrative. So what's the narrative and who controls the narrative? I just saw the other day Somalia, who have been delaying their elections for a number of years now. A lot of their financing comes from the Western world, right? And the Western world is giving them these conditions, like you need to complete your elections by this date or that date. You need to be able to have 30% female representation in parliamentary positions. Otherwise, we're not going to give you funding. We're going to, sanction you for certain things. So who's controlling that narrative? And when it comes to making up those rules, how involved are we as Africans in the negotiating table? And also we as African journalists, how are we highlighting those African leaders that are driving the conversations? That's what I thought about. So I came across this research that was just released that really depicts where we are with the African narrative on the global stage or the global world. And I think you can think about this even in your newsroom and the kinds of stories that, you see a lot going on. So where are we today? There's a report by Africa No Filter, and it's basically called the Business in Africa Narrative Report. The report just basically shines light on the persistent narratives that we have about Africa on business in Africa. And it basically analyzed 750 million stories that were published about Africa between 2017 and 2021. And this research showed that 70% of coverage about business in Africa references foreign powers, including China, the USA, Russia, France, and the UK. So basically, Africa became relevant in the global space when you're mentioning these superpowers. The narratives are being driven by these superpowers. How many African stories are we telling from our point of view and that are being shared as a standalone story without having to reference other major superpowers? That's something to think about. Just the fact that 70% of African coverage has to do with these Western countries when you look at it at the global scale. Also, another interesting fact was that corruption was referenced in nearly 10% of stories on business in Africa. It is a reality, yes. A lot of African countries are grappling with corruption, but corruption is not an African problem. Corruption happens everywhere in the world. It happens in America, it happens, even in the UK and other countries. But then when it comes to African coverage, why is it so predominantly negative? Also, another interesting fact is that less than 1% of the coverage on business in Africa referenced the Africa Free Trade Agreement. When you think about the fact that we've been pushing trade amongst African countries for the longest time, and finally it got launched last year on the 1st, and so much financing has gone into it. Yet when it comes to coverage as far as how this system is actually working, what impact it has made in trade amongst Africans, we see almost nothing when it comes to that coverage, less than 1%. Yet we talk of global trade wars. We talk about how the Ukraine and Russia crisis is having an impact on trade in Africa. Why aren't we amplifying our voices when it comes to trade amongst ourselves? And also another important fact was women represented only 29% of all stories that were told on subjects to do with business, and only 12% of the experts or sources used were women. That's really important to highlight because even we in the newsroom are trying to be really conscious about having a 50-50 rule where we try to have as many women as possible to come out and come out as experts and also sources as well, but not just women coming on as experts, but also in the newsroom. Just think about, even when I look at the ratio here, it's a bit more balanced, but in most newsrooms we do see that there are, especially in business journalism, we don't have many female voices and faces telling these stories. So these statistics basically highlights some of the problematic narratives that we have on the African continent, the narratives on business in Africa, and the kinds of stories that we hear when it comes to reporting business in Africa and finance development. And this study, it's also important to note that they just didn't study international media houses. They also studied African media, and they also looked at digital stories and academic landscapes as well. So it's not just, global media houses that are pushing forward this negative, African narrative. Another interesting finding in this report was that when you think about the African continent, even when I thought about the African narrative, how are we African? What does it mean to be African? We're talking about over 50 different countries, different languages, different cultures. And then when you look at each country, each of them have different, subcultures and different regions that are dealing with various economic issues. So how do you then group all of this into one continent? So an interesting finding is that nearly 50% of articles in global media outlets reference South Africa or Nigeria. Why? And I think me having to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, it's something that I grapple with every single day, because when you talk about BBC News and you talk about a pan-African show, if I'm to be very honest, sometimes when it comes to finding experts, we end up covering news. First of all, we're limited by our location, by what we're exposed to. So for me personally, being Kenyan and having lived in Kenya and having covered a lot of local news, then for a very long time, my mind was very narrow when it came to coverage in business news. I only thought of Kenya, I only thought of East Africa, and then all of a sudden, I started having to present a pan-African show, and I had to start building my networks and my contacts in Botswana, in Chad, or in Mozambique, countries that, if I'm to be honest, maybe I've never visited before, and I virtually know nothing about. So how do you even begin reporting in these different countries that you've never had a chance to even, visit? And how can you genuinely and ethically call yourself, a Pan-African show if you're not actively covering these other countries? So the BBC has tried to expand their outreach and their network, and they started, hiring lots of correspondents and freelancers in different parts of the continent, but it's nowhere near where we need it to be. We still need lots of correspondents, and maybe the BBC is able to do that because they have the financial capacity, but when you look at local media, they don't really have that financial capacity to be able to hire all of these, different correspondents in different regions of the continent. So also another major challenge in covering African countries is that we lack a lot of data. Or even for me, if I want to cover a story in Mozambique, I may not know where to find all the data. Where do I even begin finding, the organizations and the research companies that are actually churning out this data, right? I'm just confined by, the access to data that I have. This is why I think that forums like this one is really important, because now you get a chance to meet journalists from different regions, from different parts of the continent. You get to exchange ideas. You get to, and slowly by slowly, you begin shifting that narrative, Even we as journalists do have certain stereotypes. When it comes to coverage in Nigeria, there's lots of coverage about, fraudsters, and I'm sure you've heard all that stuff about cyber attacks and all of that. But there's also a lot that's happening in Nigeria when it comes to, business development and the growth of just the economic development in that region. So I think also in shifting the African narrative, we have to challenge our own biases and our own stereotypes that we may hold that, affects our writing or even just our scope as far as what makes a story and how to tell the story. So how do African journalists report on Africa? Well, African media outlets perpetuated negative stories about Africa, but also at the same time, foreign-based media take a huge chunk of Africa's media landscape. So all the stories that are coming out there are actually on a global scale, on African stories, are done by foreign-based medias like the BBC, like France's AFP. So reporting about Africa, 35% of reports originate from non-African media outlets. And according to a questionnaire on the most popular African outlet over the last year, only 7 out of the top 25 were based on the African continent. So not only do we, this is a huge challenge, the fact that the African stories that are told out there are done by people that are not even based in Africa. All right, so why do we have such a heavy foreign presence in media? Why is it so strong in Africa? Well, one major challenge is, of course, funding. 63% of surveyed media groups said they don't have correspondents in other African countries. 2/3 of them just have no way of actually finding out what's happening in another country, in another continent, which is why networking is also important, just having those contacts. I can't tell you the number of people that I have in my WhatsApp that I've never met in my life, but have been so influential in terms of feeding me with information on what's happening in different parts of the continent. Some media houses have experienced such massive budget cuts. I think that was covered, I heard that earlier on when someone was talking about retrenchment. And they no longer have a presence outside large urban centers and are forced to rely on external sources. The second major challenge is press freedom. I think, we can all attest to the challenges that we've had working in local media. There was a professor in South Africa that said, many countries have no strong tradition of a free press or freedom of expression that allows African media groups to report independently. We saw this a lot during the COVID pandemic when it came to COVID reporting and the transparency when it came to, reporting the numbers and things like that. And many African viewers or the audience tend to believe Western sources more than local sources because of that element of press freedom. So there was an example here given in Nigeria. I'll just read this quote. That Nigerians tend to believe Western sources more than Nigerian sources because they believe the Western media, are free from political interference. He also spoke of unconscious bias. For example, in Nigeria and Ghana, individuals with political or economic connections own most media houses, which erodes the trust of the media house among the public. I think to some extent we've all dealt with that in one way or another. So also that question as far as, how safe you are in being able to report in these stories and what your media houses are doing to ensure that you remain safe and that you are given the resources to be able to tell these stories without fear and in an impartial and in a objective way. So this is just a point of reflection, just questions I thought that we could ask ourselves as journalists is, how do we amplify diverse ideas? How do we become an agent for that, to be able to have different voices telling these African stories while also at the same time staying true to the reality of the country and the challenges that they are dealing with? So beyond the continent, if you're looking just even beyond different countries, just looking at your own country, how are you reporting on the local levels? If I'm reporting in Kenya, am I only looking at Nairobi, Mombasa, and the major cities that people know of? Or am I also taking the initiative to think about finance development and how that has an impact in other parts, in rural areas of the country, or just areas that we don't hear much about, where there are even language barriers as well, and cultural differences as well. So how much of the different and diverse communities are you representing in the kinds of stories that you tell? Yeah. I also just wanted to talk about the power of media and the narrative that we tell, how much we actually influence in terms of what people perceive about the African continent, what people perceive about finance development, and all these debts that we talk about. We actually play a huge role in how people view Africa, not just globally, but also like on the local level. So media is a very powerful tool in shaping the way communities perceive the world. And how then do we begin to be conscious and to be very intentional about changing the problematic narratives that we've seen on financial development that seems to be more skewed towards the Western world, or seems, how do we dismantle that and then change and shift the narrative from Africa being the rule taker to actually Africa being the rule maker? Just to give a bit of context to the power of media, there was a study that was done on racial narratives and how that plays out in journalism. This is based in the States, but I think we can relate to this in one way or another. There was a survey that showed that 78% of journalists felt strongly that race and culture were really important to consider when reporting. However, they also felt that people of color were overrepresented in a negative light or missing from the news entirely. So they felt that they were wiped out, they couldn't see themselves in the news. And according to the survey, 67% felt African Americans were overrepresented in a negative light, while 51% felt Asian narratives weren't represented at all. So how inclusive are you being in your reporting? Are you truly reflecting the ideas, thoughts, and perspectives of all the communities that you're surrounded with every single day? 61% of African American respondents felt that their narrative were missing or were overrepresented in a negative light in news media, and 36% of Asian Americans felt that their narratives were missing entirely. When we talk about finance development, how represented are the African views on finance development? So too often our current narratives fail to tell stories that truthfully represent all cultures, ethnicities, backgrounds. Some stories are absent, some are mistold, while others only highlight negatives and never the positives. These incomplete and frequently single narratives influence how we perceive the world and how we interact with each other. So how do we establish new narratives? I think it begins with, and also I'd love to hear all your different views, and we also have a panel discussion after this. I'm sure my colleagues would be able to give their ideas. But I think it begins with having critical conversations like this. It begins with us having conversations on the dinner table, in the newsrooms, with your friends, with your colleagues, on the importance of representation that is inclusive, like what we're doing here today. So when we talk about Africa being a rule maker, a trailblazer, leading the way, not us actually taking rules by the Western world, but us actually being conscious about how we tell our stories, how do we highlight that through the stories that we give? Who are we speaking to and why? And who is leading these conversations? Who are the voices that you're giving? When you talk, have you ever challenged the IMF to give you an African expert, for example? The other day, I was taken to the UNDP for the conference that they just had. And I made a request to make sure that we have a black face giving us, what they're talking about. Just small things like that can shift the narrative as far as African voices and us being the rule maker rather than the rule taker. So don't be afraid to also ask for the people that you want to talk to rather than, especially when you're talking to these international institutions like the World Bank, like IMF and the UN. There are lots of Africans who are representing us today that can shed light on a lot of these issues. I think it also takes a lot of awareness as journalists. We can only make an impact and only change our continent, just being aware as a journalist that we have a huge influence on the changes on our continent, that we influence policies as the media. But we also influence the world's view on the African narrative, and we are also shaping the world today and their views on finance development and how Africa is managing debt and all of these things. And just think about in your capacity what you can do. So for me, being on BBC Money Daily, I made a pledge to myself that I will always give Black people a voice. No matter who the bosses are in that particular organization, I'm going to put an effort to find a Black face. And if they can't offer me a Black face, then I'll be like, no, thank you. We don't need to have you on the show. It doesn't make sense to have a white talking head talking about African issues on a Pan-African show. So being that strict about it and just sticking to the brand has made it a lot easier for me, that now when I get approached by different organizations, the first thing they're like, okay, now I know, Maya, we have to offer you a non-Kenyan, we have to offer you somebody from, a different part of the continent, and this person is multilingual. And then also just thinking about the different languages that we can broadcast in. All right. A few examples that I felt really depicts what it means to paint Africa in that light, as far as them being the rule maker and not the rule taker, was the COP26, the talk on climate change, and what the narrative was on climate change and what people were talking about when it came to climate financing, and just a few articles that I came across which I really felt they hit they just hit it really well when it comes to just depicting Africa as a rule maker. There's this one that was done by The Mast, which highlighted Malawi's president, and a really powerful soundbite that he had. He told the leaders basically at COP26, pay up or perish with us. So this media house, rather than taking the major announcements that were made by the leaders, the G20 at the leaders or whatever, decided that they were going to actually headline this, that, Chakwera had a very important point to note, and that he was actually giving the Western world, a condition that it's not a charity act. So you either pay up because you caused a lot of the climate issues and the climate environmental issues that we're facing right now, or perish with us. And also, they were actually holding the Western countries to account and saying, you guys actually had committed this much and this much and this much, to finance Africa in being able to adapt to all of the challenges that climate change has brought to us, but you actually haven't delivered. So are you as a journalist also highlighting those voices, the voices that are speaking up against the West and their conditions, and they are setting their own rules and their own conditions as well. There's also this other article that I came across in Malawi again, where it talks about give solutions, not broken promises to the poor, Chakwera tells the world leaders. So it's not the world leaders telling us how to solve our own issues, but it's us African voices who are actually giving the solutions that will solve, the countries, the economic challenges that we face. There's another article here that highlights the West causing the climate crisis. It should be now them to clean up the mess. So it's basically, holding the Western world to account and asking the question of when rich countries will actually take the responsibility as far as, the climate issues that they have caused. Yeah, so that's just something to think about. Those are just a few examples. You can read the articles in your own time. I've just put them on there. So when we're thinking about constructing news and thinking about what are some of the elements that defines the narrative. What are some of the things that we can consider as journalists? Well, one is the use of sources, which I think I've repeated here time and time again. So thinking about the individuals that you speak to, the organizations or the agencies that you speak to, who are your contacts? As a journalist, you are as good as your contacts. So think about the research organizations that are doing research in Africa, that are telling African stories, that have local data. Also think about organizations who are holding power to account, who are involved in policy making, who have various proposals on the solutions that we need in development finance, unconventional solutions that put Africa on the map as a rule maker and not, a rule taker. Also think about individuals who are breaking the status quo, who are bold, who speak up, and who are about change. Also, secondly, just knowing that you are the rule maker as well in the newsroom. So thinking about the agenda that you are setting. You set the agenda, you get to decide, which I think is a very privileged position to be in, because at the end of the day, you are deciding what you think is newsworthy. You are the one who's deciding what you think is important for people to know, and you are the gatekeeper. You choose for the audience and determine what they need to know, what needs to be noticed, what needs to be paid attention to, what needs to be debated, and what needs to be scrutinized. So when you're thinking about the African narrative and how that has been painted in negative light and how, we are the ones who don't set the conditions, but are the ones who rather follow the conditions, how are you part of that narrative, and how can you change that narrative? And then also our role to hold power to account is that we should be able to feel free to ask questions. I know press freedom sometimes is a challenge depending on where it is that you are living. Asking questions, when we come up with all these conditions, we find out that the World Bank has given, I think a loan of 86 billion was approved in Kenya the other day. What's in it for Africa? Not looking at it from that other perspective, as far as what they're planning to do and what they want to invest in, what the Western world wants to invest in, but what's in it for Africa? How are we benefiting from the financing? Are the terms fair? Are the terms transparent? And just making sure that we're part of that conversation and we are on that negotiation table.